Thank you so much, Monica, Jennifer, and I'm going to ask you to come back up to the for the panel discussion. And Stacy, thank you. Okay, just a logistical question. Do I have to do anything with the monitor here, or I take that as a no? So, okay, well, thank you so much to our speakers. Those were all tremendously informative presentations. So thank you all. I invite our audience to either come to the microphone, or if you're online, please feel free to type in your questions. And I see we have somebody already at the mic. Please go ahead with your question.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for your presentations. Going back to the topic of copays, I wanted to ask if any of you could provide any insights on how patient copays may hinder recruitment and retention, especially regarding like long-term expenses related to that, and how have you implemented resources to help patients with that?
Well, I work in pediatrics, so I think that there are a lot more potential resources out there for pediatric patients than adult patients. And we have some really great social workers at almost every institution I've ever worked at that really are quite adept at helping to find financial assistance for some of our pediatric patients and families. I will say with our newer CIRM grants, we're actually building in some funding for patients that enroll in some of our newer CIRM grants. And so that's helped to provide a lot of assistance with patients, especially those traveling from far away that have to stay locally for an extended period of time. Caregivers often have to take time off work and, find transportation and meals. So I think that's helped a lot for our patients. It's been an unexpected, I think, burden on the research team, because then we have to manage, reimbursements and that funding, and have a lot of conversations with families about maximum amounts as well. But I think that's been beneficial. But I have seen impacts of families, even a patient that came from out of state enrolled in the CIRM trial, so got a lot of financial assistance, but had a lot of copays with insurance, and that has been a financial burden. And I don't know that that's really fully resolved, because there are some resources, but they can't help with everything. So I think especially from patients that come from far away, especially we have a number of referrals from St. Jude to our institution, Stanford, and St. Jude, like, families don't really have to pay for anything. And so when they come to a very expensive campus like Stanford, and our costs are quite high and copays may be high, it's been a bit of a challenge. So.
Anybody else have anything to add?
I would just say, much like Stacy, our institution also has wonderful social workers, and they get involved. They know quite a bit of the grants and programs that patients can use. I know Leukemia Lymphoma Society a lot of times has some grants. There's a bunch of them. We also will sometimes reach out to sponsors to see if they would be willing to help all of the patients that are on the trial, because they can't do it for just one. But if they're willing to increase the amount that they're willing to subsidize for the trial for the patient to be on it, sometimes that can come into play. Again, the stipends and the reimbursements also will help. And then City of Hope also has resources sometimes that can be used to cover the cost of the hotels. We try to keep our hotel costs relatively low compared to the hotels in the local area to help with patients' costs.
Thank you.
And I will add, just pediatrics, we also have in most of our institutions the Ronald McDonald House, which I know they don't really have for adults. So that helps provide free housing for many of our families that come from far away. So I think we need something like that for the adult world as well.
Do we have any other questions from the floor? Otherwise, I'm happy to jump in with a few. Okay. Again, just really great topics. I think, Monica, you had mentioned something that's really important, which is, doing those operational pre-reviews of the protocols. And I think for those of us, and I say us in the grand sense, because it's really the teams that are out there. Yeah, the royal we. But I think you start to gain a little bit of an experience in terms of what's going to work and what isn't going to work. It's always easier to, I think, modify a protocol when it's something that's within your sphere of control, like it's an investigator-initiated trial. I'm just wondering, perhaps Jennifer or Stacy, how have you managed making updates to protocols with working with sponsors? Have you found them to be open to making those modifications? Because after all, it's their data that's going in. You want to make sure you've got good data and it's not out of the windows and all of those things.
So I would say yes, absolutely. Usually the sponsors are pretty open to receiving feedback, and oftentimes the number of amendments that come are quite numerous. But that's also based on the feedback that they're getting and the information that they're getting from the trial. So I would say a lot of times when we're going through SIVs, we're looking at the feasibility at our institution. By the clinical research nurse may look at the study design and the visits, the lab draws. Sometimes those lab draws, they can, they're not realistic if you're doing an outpatient visit, expecting the patient to be there 12, 14 hours. I know our Briskin nurses love you. They're the ones that are having to sit with the patients, from the sun up to sundown and then beyond. And so that's the time where the CRN is going to go back to sponsor and say, do we really need all of these lab draws? Can we maybe draw out the last one or push it up, so that we're not making, little Jane Smith that's 90 years old sitting in an outpatient facility for 12 to 14 hours. The other part is that when we're doing these safety meetings, that's where some of these things come up as well. I've been known to send emails to sponsors to say, hey, can we adjust the treatment days? Can we put in windows? This scan, realistically, based on the PI, they may not feel that it's necessary. They may want to do a different scan. Would this be something that would be allowable? And then usually we'll get some kind of plan deviation and then be able to do it going forward on the next amendment.
If I can just add not so much about the sponsors and modifications, but kind of piggybacking on Dara's talk from yesterday about the importance of having an experienced clinical nurse on your team who can often look at a protocol up front and kind of predict how this is going to work for patients and families, right, and in the hospital structure. But I also think the importance of having nursing involvement when people are writing these protocols, because nurses can often upfront identify things like that's not going to work. But yeah, I think just having a strong nursing team, I think, is really important in research too.
Right. And I mean, the fact that the people that are writing the protocols are not necessarily the ones doing the protocols. And so we don't necessarily know the execution of these things that are outlined in the protocols. So whether it be, IITs or the sponsor initiated trials, it is important for nurses to constantly be giving feedback on what is working and what's not, just to ensure that, moving forward, we make better choices when writing protocols.
I think can ultimately help minimize deviations when the studies are active, if you identify them in advance.
There's definitely a voice for our nursing community in the conduct of these trials. So I'm sort of feeling very empowered just listening to this, because it is so important at the end of the day to make sure that these trials are done appropriately. Another question for our panel, unless we have somebody that has a question. I don't want to monopolize the floor. Okay. I'm going to sort of circle back to the patient, because I think our first audience question was a really important one about some of the challenges for our patients who are enrolling on these trials from a reimbursement perspective. I think this one is sort of looking to, and just listening to all of you talk about the complexities of these trials. Certainly for the study team, there's also that component of the complexity of these trials for the patients as well. I'm just wondering if any of you could speak to how you manage the expectations of these patients, that for many of them, this is probably their viewing as the best option. There's a lot of motivation for them to enroll. How do you manage the expectations and what their role is, tying back to Monica's presentation, to help make sure we're all compliant? What's their role? How do you engage them in that as well? Sure, Jennifer.
I think it is really important to manage expectations up front in the consent process, that patients understand that these trials really are to gather data to try to figure out the next treatments going forward that are going to be FDA approved. But for the patient, that's not what they're looking at. They're looking at their hope, and many of them are, relapsed refractory. They've gone through all kinds of treatments before, and they just want something that's going to work. And so I think it's important that you sit down as a clinical research nurse and talk to the patients and tell them, look, this is not FDA approved. We have not confirmed the efficacy of this. We have data that suggests that this is going to be a useful tool, but we can't provide that information, into the future. We don't know how your body's going to adjust to the drug. Everybody's body is different. Some people may do really well. You may not. Obviously, we're not going to go into this thinking that your body is not going to handle it well, but the reality is we just don't know. So understand that the study is looking for the data, the study outcomes, whereas your physician is always going to put your best interest at heart. And so if the physician didn't feel that this was working for you, then they're going to, adjust it, take you off study, if that's the appropriate role. But there is a difference between what the study is looking at and what the physician and what the patient's looking at, and explaining that.
And so I'm no longer patient facing, but many moons ago I used to be, and I was involved in the consenting process. And so I understand how it is important to set expectations ahead of time for patients, just to not only help, because it's uncertain, they're starting on these studies, they have no idea what to expect. And so now that I'm on the other side and I'm writing these consent forms, so what we do is, a variation of the study calendar that's included in the protocols, we make a more simplified version of that for the consent forms. So just so they can kind of follow along in terms of the time points and then how they move through the study. And so speaking also to the compartmentalization of the different phases of the study, and just being able to, it's easier. So in terms of, having these expectations written out in words, as opposed to having some kind of table or matrix that they can follow along with all the different time points, it helps set expectations early. And then in terms of compliance and just they can kind of manage their expectations throughout the study.
Thank you so
And
much.
I think sometimes it requires multiple conversations, because like doing a consent conference, I don't know about where you all at my institution, they're often 90 minutes a minimum. And they're often consenting for multiple biospecimen and additional studies. And so I think sometimes it has to be a process with the patients and families, and it might not all be answered in that 90-minute. And so that takes more time for the clinical team or the research team as well. But I think that is often what is needed sometimes.
And we all know that the amount of time that the PIs spend with these patients is so much less than the time that the CRNs are patient facing. And so it really comes down to the CRN's commitment to informing patients and being available for questions. And you guys do a great job of managing expectations throughout.
Thank you so much. Do we have one more question?
One. I wanted to talk a little or get your input on, we spoke about deviations and a kappa and what would warrant a kappa. Like you said that there's a minor, major, critical deviations. Is there some sort of, algorithm that can warrant a kappa versus something else?
Right. So in terms of City of Hope and the reporting structure that we have, so major deviations, so those that affect patient safety and data integrity, are reported expeditiously in IRIS. And so within that form, we have fields that they have to outline the kappa. The study teams have to outline the kappa. And typically it's the CRCs that report these deviations. So minor deviations, they go into Encore and they're not reviewed in real time in the same way that the majors are, but they are reviewed in summary form at the time of either continuation or the safety review done by a DSMC. And so but even in the summary reporting, there is still a kappa that's required. It may not be as rigorous because typically there is no effect on patient safety, or that risk-benefit ratio is not necessarily altered at all. But it is required, because even if it's something that's more administrative in nature and is not affecting patient safety, it's still an administrative burden that needs to be remedied in such a way. So the CAPA may be that we will submit a protocol amendment within 30 days. So it may not be above and beyond and changing policies and procedures, but some kind of action would need to be taken in order to try to mitigate that, regardless of the severity.
Yes, because we say, mistakes happen, or we know deviations are going to occur. So how do you mitigate that in the amendment or your documentation? I always just wonder what that looks like. If it's something that simply just gets missed, how does the sponsor receive that information? And do they permit for that? Like, oh, we know these things happen.
Right. So I think the key is the trends. So a one-off of a missed visit or an out of window visit, those things in isolation are not necessarily escalated. But because those minor deviations are reviewed in summary form, whether it be by the IRB or the DSMC, they're able to see within the last year, within the last 6 months, within the last quarter, how many of these deviations have occurred. And so if there's flags that start to go off that, okay, that particular pre-LD CSF collection was out of window for 15 of the 30 patients, well, something has to give here. So then one of the conditions for that review will be, please submit submit an amendment in order to create a window or move it to another appointment. So I think, in isolation, those events are not necessarily, if it's a single event, nobody is sounding the alarms, but it's in aggregate is when change is implemented.
All right. Well, we are at time. Thank you all so much for the questions, your time and energy here, and a very special thank you to our presenters today. Really helpful information.